One of the most common struggles students, teachers, and by extension the reading public in general have is understanding fiction beyond the surface action. Of course, a reader can garner some value or maybe even a lasting impression from just the objective facts of a story. But what happens when fiction doesn't lend itself to simple interpretation? The action might be unclear, or the action is so clear that attaching an emotional abstraction seems impossible. Think of writers like Chekhov, Carver, Tolstoy, Hemingway. What then? The first thing is to read the story and read it attentively. Take, for example, Anton Chekhov's A Trifle from Life. This is one of those stories whose details are so objective and clear that extracting a larger concept from them seems impossible. This guy, Belyaev, gets all heated over some secret meetings his girlfriend's kids have been having with their father. Well, so what, right? What does that tell me? What can I get from that? Well, the reader should always highly consider the first paragraph. Who is being introduced? Where are they? What words are used to describe the characters or settings? Any writer of merit will define in some way, objectively or abstractedly, the important emotions or characters within the first paragraph. There are millions and millions of ways to portray this, so how does Chekhov do it? In the first paragraph of A Trifle from Life, there's a lot to extract, especially in the descriptions of Belyaev. Here's just the first sentence as an example. A well-fed, red-cheeked young man called Nikolai Ilyich Belyaev of 32, who was an owner of house property in Petersburg and a devotee of the racecourse, went one evening to see Olga Ivanovna Ernin, with whom he was living, or, to use his own expression, was dragging out a long, wearisome romance. The clearest descriptions of Belyaev here are well-fed, red-cheeked, and young man. So what does that say about him? Before I get into the analysis part here, I do want to say that such descriptions and sentences can easily fly over the reader's head at first glance, especially to the inattentive. It isn't of the greatest importance to memorize each fact so long as the reader, by the end of the story, is left with a lasting impression. It is then one gets a lasting impression they can go back and scrub through these details to understand in clear, precise terms what that lasting impression was. So going back to Belyaev and what we learn about him in the first paragraph, he is red-cheeked, well-fed, and a devotee of the racecourse, meaning he loves watching the horse races. What kind of person is that? Who is that describing? Characteristically, what can be said about him? After reading and watching the action of the story unfold, it's logical to define these characteristics as someone who is immature and childish. A 32-year-old who is described in the same terms as a baby, red-cheeked and well-fed. His relationship with Olga, too, the prolonged romance, so to speak, is not something a mature grown-up would tolerate either. By no mistake, the next character to enter in the story as a comparison to Belyaev is an 8-year-old boy named Alyosha. Another sign of a good story, one worth understanding and analyzing, are the richness and complexities of its characters, and especially if the characters are not flat, again, unless for humorous reasons. They're not there to serve the purpose of the plot or to further establish and prove whatever the author's opinions of politics or humanity may be. Characters in good fiction will have their own wills and wants. And that way, by understanding and scrutinizing Alyosha, an even more deeper interpretation of the story can appear. So how is Alyosha described? It's not as discernible as it is with Belyaev because the narrator's sympathies lie with him, but by observing his actions and speech, one can describe him in clear terms. So what is he doing? The most telling thing is his imitating. He is trying to be something he is not. And in this specific case, it is an acrobat. Another telling description of him comes at the end of the paragraph, and that is, he regretted that God had given him such a restless body. He hates being a child. Look at how he talks, too. Good evening, Nikolai Ilyich. Mother will be here directly. She has gone with Sonia to the dressmaker's. This does not sound like a child, but more like a child's interpretation of an adult. and that's what he's doing. He is imitating an adult, trying to behave and sound older than he is. It should be of no surprise, then, that with their opposing beliefs and actions, their tension should spill over eventually and lead to the climax of the story. And that is when Belyaev confronts Olga Ivanovna about Alyosha's secret meetings with his father. Though secrecy is an immature behavior, it is still an adult one. Belyaev is distraught like a child, and when he's confronted with gossip about himself, he becomes irate and inconsolable and breaks his word of honor with Alyosha. Another child's game, but you promised. The lack of maturity from Belyaev clashes with the false maturity of Alyosha. And though he is a boy of 8, he has learned the consequences of adult life, and rightfully so, by pretending to be an adult. Before that, he had only known the world as sweet pears, pies, and expensive watches, and now knows he is out of his depth in a world where great many a things for which the language of children has no expression. And although Alyosha plays this game, often in the story he is betrayed by his inherent self. When he sits with Belyaev, he plays with his watch chain, much like a very young child. And later, when caught in a lie, again like a child, cannot hide anything. By scratching the locket and stammering, he gives himself away. He is a child. This isn't a game. But there is a subtle indication that he might not be so innocent in this, for in some way he understands the direness of adult life. After he tells Belyaev about his father's babblings, about he and his sister being unfortunate, he turned his attention to a stuffed bird and sank into thought. It is no coincidence that this detail comes at such a pivotal time in the story, when the conversation between he and Belyaev turns sour. He gazes at a dead thing and it shuts him up. This is a story of maturity and authenticity of character, staying true to one's soul. For Belyaev, things in his life will go unchanging, much like as at the beginning of the story, he goes on to dismiss Alyosha as he always had before. His life will remain stagnant because his immaturity and selfishness prevent him from learning any sort of lesson. Alyosha, trying to play this adult thing, is subsequently greatly affected by Belyaev's immaturity, and once confronted with a real adult situation, has no ability to digest it, and he reverts to his childish demeanor. But at least for him, he learns something. In this way, scrutinizing and understanding the characters in fiction is a pathway to understanding any story. What do these characters covet? What in their souls is opposing to the world or other characters around them? This will be the character struggle and typically the greatest tension of any story, and this doesn't extend to literary fiction only. Ned Stark in A Game of Thrones has such a downfall because the tension of his traditional character is in opposition to the cutthroat, ever-changing personality of the Lannisters. And what does it mean that our first meeting of him is him beheading someone, and our last is his own beheading? What is that trying to say? So after a tentative reading, the purpose of the story becomes clear and the ramifications greater than just the surface-level action. And that's what understanding fiction means. You take the objective details, and of course some of the not-so-objective ones, and ask, what do those point to on a greater scale? What can be gleaned and understood from the action? It's almost a game of pattern recognition. What does it mean that Alyosha speaks as if he were a man? Does he learn some sort of lesson from it? What does that lesson say? And what of Belyaev? What can we say about him? And although it might not be exact to our own lives, we should relate it to a similar situation. And being once a teacher and, of course, a child, the story is both recognizable to me from Alyosha's standpoint and Belyaev's. I alluded to it, but it's always worth considering that in good fiction there are no good versus evil characters, unless it's played out for comical effect. Think Twain or O'Connor and some Faulkner. Alyosha is not the poor, innocent child, nor is Belyaev the evil man who loves to make children cry, though Alyosha would have you believe otherwise. There is a subtlety between them. Though Chekhov definitely scorns both ways of life by ending the story in misery, he understands that people are people, with weaknesses, strengths, likes, dislikes, and so on. no one's the devil outright, and no one is God too. So in understanding fiction, don't assume characters are evil or good. Fiction is nothing without its characters, and understanding the characters means understanding the story. And trust that the writer has put every word in its correct place.